I'm nearing the end of my life, and it's been a funny period to live in. Thermonuclear weapons were first detonated when I was 3, and they dominated the fear of the whole population of the world for decades. Now we're fearing climate change with just as much reason, and you do have to accept that humanity needs to learn its mistakes every generation and just go through these cycles of futility and aggression and cruelty and stupidity. What if AI were to actually put its mind to a science of practical compassion for everybody? Because after all, we want free lives. We don't want AI telling us what to do with the whole of our lives, but we do seek that comfort, that network that will support us at the times when we are ill, bereaved, despondent, and in need of human comfort and assistance. And that's basically what we doctors like to think of ourselves as providing. And I think we will continue to provide that. But I think we need to be humble as well and realize that we could do it a lot better. And if the right machines were to come along and help us do it, that's going to be a fabulous thing.
Hello and welcome to Clinical Changemakers. Today on the show we have Dr. Richard Lehman. He is a retired GP from the UK and a respected academic in the field of evidence-based medicine. We're also being joined by Dr. Raj Mehta, a family medicine physician from Florida who's also a researcher and informaticist. Dr. Lehman and Dr. Mehta, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you for having us.
Great to be with you.
Today, I'm really excited to talk about all things evidence-based medicine. You guys have done your own podcast series on that very topic, going in deep into this fascinating area. I wanted to start off with a why. Richard, why is evidence-based medicine important to you?
It's important because it shaped my whole medical career. It came in while I was practicing, and now I think it's going out after I've finished practicing, but that's a controversial statement we'll come back to. Neither of these associations is causal. And I was given a ringside seat in a way by practicing as a GP in Oxfordshire in the 1980s. And there were a lot of keen people who were developing the methods of evidence-based medicine, notably Ian Chalmers in Oxford. And then we had Dave Sackett come and become our professor of evidence-based medicine at Oxford University. These things really shook the ground from under our feet a bit. They confirmed many things that we knew must be correct, but they opened up new perspectives. And at the same time, there were huge technological advances which allowed all these things to be done in real time for the first time. So that's it in a nutshell from me.
Raj?
I would say that a core part of being a physician is the idea of working in a scientific field. And science means that you have the skills or the ability to discern truth from fiction, to separate it out. And, you learn as a child, what is a scientific method as a student, and you get older. And now being a professional in the medical field, what are the skill sets? How do I approach learning what the truth is to the best of my ability and then applying it to patient care? And it's a very tricky thing, and it's not at all similar to how we imagine other basic sciences operate. And I think the core of EBM kind of starts getting to that. And it's really important to understand it because that's what gives us as average clinicians the skill set to be able to do that. And without that, I fear that we just end up copying others. We really have to ask, are we really people who can discern truth or not, if we don't understand how to ask questions and get the answers?
Yeah, I just want to pick up on that comment there, Raj, around discerning truth, because something kind of implicit in the name in evidence-based medicine and that timing of Richard, your ringside experience sort of implies that before that time, we couldn't discern truth. or perhaps our methodologies were lacking. Richard, what was it like to be practicing at that junction between what we were doing and then this new paradigm?
Of course, we did acknowledge the idea of truth very much. And in fact, one of the great attractions of medicine was that it was a truth seeking exercise in a way that many human activities aren't. And there is, in fact, a fabulous collection of materials describing the process of truth seeking, as Raj has put it, called the James Lind Library. And we've also done some podcasts about that. It's a search that goes back thousands of years. And the opposite of truth is not deliberate falsehood, though it can be. The opposite of truth is opinion, really, and conviction. And conviction-based medicine is probably the most dangerous of all. And there was certainly a lot of that about when I was a medical student. And these convictions, which were based on partial reading of the evidence, were collected together in massive tomes like the Oxford Textbook of Medicine and all those famous books that now litter the unread shelves of libraries throughout the world. And we used to dip into those, when I was a senior house officer working a weekend and I got a case of bacterial endocarditis, believe it or not, I went to the textbook to find out what to give. And it said 4 grams of penicillin every 4 hours plus streptomycin, because it was an old textbook. And I gave this patient that. And although they had a staphylococcal SBE, they recovered very quickly because those doses would not allow any germ to live in their body. So there was that these things had been learned, as it were, by trial and error. Unless they were barn door truths, it was very likely that there was some element of falsehood and opinion creeping into everything that was written about how to manage particular illnesses. And of course, there still is. But the effort of evidence-based medicine is to question every accepted truth and make sure that it can actually satisfy some conditions for what we recognize as truth.
So, just touching on some of that historical context, I think it's really interesting to think about how we go from sort of infinite possibilities of solving a problem or curing somebody, and we inch those possibilities down. And there were various people throughout history in different societies and cultures who helped us sort of narrow that gap towards that truth claim about how to solve these particular problems. I know that James Lind, as you mentioned, was a part of that. Richard, could you comment on his contributions?
His contribution was to examine scurvy, a condition of unknown origin that killed probably 2 million British sailors and countless more people in other situations, and arose if people were denied fresh food for about a month. And at this point, they started falling apart, literally, because we now know that scurvy is a condition of collagen non-production. Vitamin C is necessary for the body to produce collagen, and collagen is what sticks us together. And as soon as we stop producing collagen, our teeth fall out, our tissues decay, our muscles weaken, our lungs start to collapse, and so on. And this is what happened to these poor men if they weren't given any source of vitamin C. James Lind looked at the entire literature, which was 200 years worth, to do with scurvy. And he saw that the Portuguese, from the beginning of long navigation, had known that getting grasses and fruits and so on to their sailors would stop them getting scurvy. And yet it was never adopted by the British Navy because we're British and we know best. And so these immense numbers of men suffered a horrible death. through lack of vitamin C. He devised a very simple, crude experiment. At least it was a comparative experiment. There were 5 arms, 2 men in each, so hardly the very acme of evidence-based medicine. But it did show that lime juice works, and all the other stuff, including hydrochloric acid and seawater, did not work. And so he's got a lot of credit for this this first trial that was a true comparative trial. But there are other examples, of course, in history of people who did do some comparative trials before him, and of course, methodology has been improved enormously since him.
Yeah, I think what's interesting also about that story is not only had some people perhaps figured elements of this out, not only his approach to creating these comparator groups as being relatively unique, but also documenting it and following it through. But then the outcomes that he sort of discovered weren't quite captured as perhaps as well as they could have in retrospect, without understanding the pure mechanism of vitamins, and then getting the uptake, getting the Royal Navy commanders and others in the health profession to take it on. What lessons do you think can be drawn from that, and perhaps parallels for right now?
Any number. I mean, people have to learn this every generation. As we saw with COVID, adoption is everything. And it's very easy to make up a lie and get that adopted. And the truth then has to struggle with that lie, as it had with chloroquine and ivermectin and all the other rubbish that people were touting, which obviously didn't work. So yes, if we talk about COVID, we can certainly show that the same tendency to ignore human life in favor of putting forward one's own preconceptions, it's still there, and it's always going to be there as long as there are human beings, unfortunately. But maybe we shall be overruled by AI in the future, and I feel that might be safer in many ways.
And just also the fact that while they were able to sort of figure out what would stop scurvy from happening, they still didn't quite understand the mechanism of how it happened. And so I think there's something interesting in that around, designing good experiments, following them through, getting them adopted, still while elements of the theory are getting worked through. And I think that's quite interesting. Raj, from where you are, in terms of the historical context of evidence-based medicine, are there any particular people, stories, or elements that are most interesting for you?
I really like jumping toward the 20th century and discussing Sir Bradford Hill and his important use of randomized controlled trials in the 20th century, and using that to really establish a gold standard for causation and how we know things are effective. And what was interesting was it was this paradigm shift where, rather than trying to come up with mechanistic explanations and models that match reality, kind of accepting that a lot of pathology and physiology was beyond our ability to model, let's just use this approach that at least gives us an answer, and then we can afterwards kind of figure out why we think it works, And I think that was really great. And it led to really a birth of modern medicine.
Tell me a bit more about randomized controlled trials. How do they work, and what is so great about them relative to doing something else?
I'd love to hear Richard talk about the history of this, because when he chats, it's always just great to listen. But I'll just briefly say that to me, it's like a magic wand. You are allowing yourself to do an experiment, and through randomization, limiting confounders that can cause bias and errors in your data. And we initially developed these approaches when we were looking at things like measuring stars in astronomy, and found strong ways to pull sample data and make predictions. We were unable to do that with data in the biological realm because there's a lot of bias. And through Fisher and his works in agriculture, we were able to create this randomization process, which let us collect unbiased data and make comparisons and make conclusions about what may be effective in a causal way. And so that was really a great advance. And it was a methodological advance more than, say, a great new technology or any of that sort of thing.
Coming to your experience, Richard, as your ringside again for how this kind of comes into practice, maybe into the language, into the thinking. Can't imagine it was sort of a light switch, but maybe it felt like that. What was it like as this new paradigm was kind of washing over the medical community? Was there a lot of resistance? Were people embracing it? What was it like?
There always is resistance, particularly when someone comes up with a term like evidence-based medicine, which implies that everyone else was a fool before we evidence seekers arrived on the scene. I think there was general acceptance at that point that it was a great idea to standardize the testing processes for new treatments. It so happened that after the Second World War, when I was born in 1950, it's a great era for barn door successes in medicine. You didn't really need randomized controlled trials for a lot of the stuff that was coming out. It just worked. And it worked on mechanistic principles, and penicillin, when loop diuretics came in for heart failure, they worked. The alternative was making holes in people's swollen legs. And when the first antipsychotics came along, you could clear out whole hospitals. You could clear out whole TB hospitals using combinations of streptomycin, isoniazid, and PAS. And then as resistance developed to those, you could tweak molecules in a way that was pretty certain to work. So up to about 1970, when I went up to read medicine in Oxford, around, it was actually 68, but I bumped up to read England. Anyway, by the time I was becoming a medical student, there was some skepticism creeping in that the great age of miracles was ending. And the great age of population medicine, i.e. dosing people with drugs on a preventive basis, was just arriving in the form of antihypertensive agents. And these were pretty crude, nasty things. The first alpha blockers and the first beta blockers had most of the side effects. Before that, there were drugs that made you terribly depressed, like reserpine, alpha methaldopa, and so on. These were horrid drugs, and nicer drugs were taking their place. So again, this was pretty obvious from the patient's point of view. There were drugs that no patient wanted to carry on with, and now there were some drugs that were nicer, and now there were lots of drug reps going around telling you that their latest beta blocker was better than the rest, etc. But we weren't too bothered about that. It was still a feeling that if you had a plausible mechanism and things that were working in the community and in hospital, you just got on and did it, and you wrote it all up in textbooks and journal articles and so on. And then gradually, as the therapeutic success ratio, as it were, the ratio of really successful drugs to Me Too drugs and not so successful drugs was gradually worsening, we realized that we needed better trials, that trials simply done by drug companies to promote their own products were not going to cut the mustard in the future. And it took a while for that to sink in. And of course, the gaming by industry is still on an enormous, devastating scale. So that for every true breakthrough, we have endless Me Too's and marginal effects. And EBM was invented, as it were, to see if these effects stood up to scrutiny. And it got off on a very good start with a team of Canadian enthusiasts. But very quickly, they began to realize that although you could prove these things on a population scale, this didn't really help you much if you're making therapeutic decisions with individual patients. And of course, this is still a major sticking point in EBM.
And I can hear how the sophistication for us to create trials and apply statistical methodologies to better understand risk and how to interpret and remove bias and confounding. I'm also wondering about some of the tools that sort of came out of that enhancement, things like numbered needed to treat, which for clinicians can be quite a valuable tool for passing some of the evidence into practice. Raj, I wondered if you could talk to perhaps some of those tools that clinicians now can apply in clinical spaces that come from these more sophisticated trials and statistical approaches.
Yes, the challenge with this is that you have this great new approach, but you're not going to then give every clinician a degree in biostats and make them study it for 2 years. So there is a need to create a curriculum and to make this material approachable, but also practical. And one of the insights I learned later on in my career is that EBM isn't really so much a study as it is heuristics. It's a decision tree to kind of simplify how you think about things. And like with any heuristic, when you apply it correctly, it can work very well. But you also have to know its limitations so you don't overemphasize it in the wrong context. So number needed to treat is a great example of this, because when you have a drug or an intervention that works, it has an effect size. In the old days, as Richard pointed out, when you give penicillin for pneumonia, it's just so effective. It's obvious. You don't even have to think about it. But if I'm giving statins for primary prevention of a heart attack, maybe it helps, 1 out of 200 patients over a 5-year period. So how do I measure that effect size? And clinical trials will give us results like odds ratio or results over a number and over a period of 5 years. And it can seem all very abstract. And number needed to treat is just a nice way to quickly convert it to give you a sense of the magnitude of your effect of your drug. And the smaller the number needed to treat, the bigger the magnitude you have. The smaller number, the magnitude is not that great. And it works really well sometimes in acute settings. If you're an ED doc, what is this drug going to do in the moment? It starts having problems when you start thinking about chronic disease, because that statin over 3 years may have an NNT of 1 in 500. Over a lifetime, it might be 1 in 3. And so that makes it much harder. But it's a super important concept, because not every drug has the same effect size. Not every drug is it works or it doesn't. There's a magnitude, there's a size, and there's some nuance to how to think about it.
Yeah, and I think it's also, sharing that with patients is really interesting. The interpretations of risk and benefit with these types of tools for different people's perspectives and backgrounds is really important for that to be shared, so you can make that right kind of shared decision. Richard, what's your take on some of the tools that have come out of evidence-based medicine and landed in the clinician's lap at the bedside?
They are inadequate, I'm afraid. We've compiled, as it were, hand atlases like road atlases from about 1750, where some of the roads are marked and some of the highwaymen are marked and some of the ditches are marked and some of the places where horses will fall over are marked, and big gaps in between, and no real context for how the lie of the land really plays out, because nobody's mapped it in sufficient detail. So you've got these bits of information. Numbers needed to treat are a sort of population-based way of looking at how many people you have to give this drug to, but the patient who's receiving the drug takes away a very mixed message. So there's a 1 in 6 chance that this will work for me. Well, yeah, okay then. If it's better than nothing, that's fine, doctor. But basically, what we need is a whole sat-nav system within medicine that tells us where there are no paths, where there are no effective treatments, things that are based on Raj's principle of truth-seeking. Do we know the truth about these things? How do we apply that truth to that person in that particular vehicle? going over that particular bit of ground. These are very rudimentary at the moment, and I know this because after I retired as a general practitioner at the age of 60, I decided I'd take a special interest in patient-centeredness and shared decision-making. And it just happened that I was incredibly lucky and got in with the right people and was eventually offered a post for 3 years in the University of Birmingham to be a professor in the shared understanding of medicine. And it didn't take me 3 years to work out that A, I wasn't the right guy because they needed somebody for the future, and B, that the shared understanding of medicine is incredibly complex and probably really an almost impossible exercise for a single human being like a GP faced with patients with multimorbidity, because the evidence is actually, it's both too much and too little. There's an awful lot out there lying in the detail of trials to do with individual effects. But of course, no single human mind can cope with all this. And so it was only after I retired totally, it was only 2 years ago, really, that I suddenly had this eureka moment that artificial intelligence now could actually collate this stuff if it were trained on it. And so I'm afraid I've become a total AI bore over the last 2 years, and run away when I start mentioning it.
All right, well, let's jump into it because I think it could be fun. I mean, it's really permeating all of our lives. Here in New Zealand, the AI scribes have really taken over a lot of general practice. Whether or not they are creating a lot of efficiency, they are certainly getting typing and those types of activities out of the way. They're allowing for perhaps more of a connection, a hands-free connection with patients, and are incredible in terms of how they summarize your information and present it back to you. In terms of its application in healthcare, obviously there's lots of big centers all over the world rushing to find out how to apply it and does it help. We've seen early research around, at least in the text-based world, patients feeling more empathy from the computers relative to the humans there. They've found interesting research around enhancing patient understanding and consent forms. So that so many applications that are going on, particularly in the evidence-based medicine space, collating information, synthesizing it, and supporting the doctor on their shoulder. Raj, I wondered, what's your take on how AI perhaps can be rejuvenating evidence-based medicine, if indeed it needs it?
Yeah, I hope we can all share Richard's enthusiasm for positive things to come. I would start by offering some historical context that a large part of what allowed the EBM movement, especially in the 90s, to take off and succeed was technology. The coming of computers and the internet allowed information to be rapidly spread, to rapidly obtained, to allow people to collaborate. Without that, I don't know if the EBM movement would have been as successful and taken off as well as it did. And so it's important to note that, with technology comes shifts and ability to grow and perhaps become better and more standardized and so on. So, just as the internet helped change how we thought about applying it and created the EBM movement, I'm hoping with AI, you can have, similar paradigm pushes forward. And I think Richard really keyed on one of the hardest areas of EBM, which is when something works well, it's kind of straightforward about making recommendations and guidelines. But there's this large area of uncertainty when you have interventions with small effect size with a great deal of uncertainty to its benefit, where patients' preferences really matter and how well you understand them. And as primary care physicians, having that relationship historically has been so important because we can know our patients and maybe help guide and prioritize them according to what they want, talk to them about it. But it's still a very imperfect process. And, hopefully AI will allow us to now engage that in a different way, because we're no longer limited to that 15-minute, or that 10-minute visit with the patient in front of us. They can be asynchronous communication. You can have dialogue trees with the AI before discussing its symptoms, what its concerns are. And then your role maybe can be a bit supervisory, where you review the things that's already been done and then jump in and help engage and point the patient the way they want to go. Not unlike having perhaps a very advanced resident or med student who initially does the work for you, and then you're coming in at the moment where you can have the greatest impact.
Richard, how do you see it being applied?
Yes, I think Raj has raised some very good points there. I see it really as being patient-driven. I'm very much for patient empowerment in a real way, not just a rhetorical way, because patients are still very powerless within the system. In some ways, they're more powerless now than ever because everything has been monetized and everything has been scrutinized by an unsympathetic management in every system, tasked with saving money above all. And while one can see that that's needed, one can also see that on the other side, there's a huge extractive system for making as much money out of illness as possible. And that's become quite shameless in the last 30 years or so. I know it's always occurred, but now it's very openly proclaimed. AI might just simply make that system of extracting money from patients far more efficient and cut the doctors out because we're expensive and most of our skills will probably wither away or be withered away by AI substitution. So that's the scary prospect. Let's not forget we have absolutely no control over this. You're not going to change the route that this technology takes. It will be decided by people with immense amounts of money and power, and we can only hope that we could perhaps steer them in more ethical directions. But I think we do have to acknowledge that the doctors we train now are going to have a completely different professional career from ourselves. We can't any longer hold ourselves up as models of human intelligence and dignity and beneficence and everything else that we like to think of ourselves as. We are going to come under scrutiny and we are going to be found wanting in all sorts of ways, simply because we are human beings working through a system of hormones and neurons and diurnal patterns and chemical forces and needs to eat and do other things during the day, which computers do not need to do and often can bypass in terms of billions of orders of fastness in seeking, when I sought information as a keen young doctor, I would go to a library and take photocopies and read them all. This was the only way to do it. As Raj said, then comes the internet and you can do it all, but you still have to be a super nerd to be able to cope with even a tiny fraction of what's out there. So AI will process all that. It will match it to the information it has about patients. It will ask the patients for the information that it doesn't have. It will suggest diagnostic methods and possibilities that we don't necessarily have ourselves, and look at any doctor's performance over a week and it deteriorates, and look over a lifetime and they burn out and they become cranks, probably like me. And so, these things will not happen with benign AI. But where do we stand? And both of you have suggested that we become interpreters, handholders, a human presence which is not entirely dispensable. Some people, and there's just been a great podcast by Brian Carmody, Sodium Sheriff, very funny and very incisive about all the medical specialisms that are going to wither away. And one of them, alas, is primary care physicians, because he sees the fact that most of the world has no primary care, and that includes large parts of America, effectively. So having a primary care system that consists of somewhere you can go and get advice and know that it's up to date, that it's not tired, that you can ask it any number of questions, you can come back to it. It's not going to charge you the earth, and it's not going to suggest impossible solutions because it will be primed to deal with realities on the ground. All that is great, and I think that's exactly what huge parts of Africa, India, China, South America, the former Soviet states, all these places are absolutely devoid of nice people to turn to when you're poorly. And it's a terrible shame. We are nice people, but we do like to help poorly people, but we know we can't do it all day long and for everybody in our country. So I think that has to be a factor. But I'm perhaps diverging here. I think the effect on evidence-based medicine is going to be that we can actually create real loops between the treatments we deploy and the outcomes that we can measure as a result of that. We won't know that those results are causal, but we'll have a fantastic array of associational data which can be interpreted again by these billion thought a second machines, and they can point us in some pretty good directions. And so that's quite apart from the techie things of designing molecules that fit this and that receptor. That's been done prior to AI. This can't be done except with AI, and I think it's really going to totally change medicine. I'm jolly glad I'm retired on a reasonable pension, and you can just forget about it.
Just forget about it, run away, huh, Richard?
Now, I want to challenge some of that idea, if I might. I was reading an interesting paper in Nature from some Princeton, I think they're computer scientists, and they speak about, is this the next pre-Copernican revolution? And what they were meaning by, before Copernicus identified that, that Earth wasn't the center of our solar system, that humans were spending decades and decades and decades getting more and more precise at measuring the rotation of the stars and the planets around the Earth. And while they couldn't quite figure out this paradigm, because ultimately they were wrong to begin with, and so they were getting better and better and better and more precise. But it was only when Copernicus came around, flipped the world around, as it were, that we're able to better understand our universe and our place in it. And so I guess what I would be curious to challenge in this sort of space is that without the sort of human agency that comes along with being able to think the way that we do relative to an AI, perhaps we can filter information with these tools a lot more quickly, and we can share that information a lot more quickly. But does that necessarily always result in enhanced outcomes and care? I'll definitely take the point that lots of parts of the world don't have access to care. And so this barrier dropper will be incredible. And I think even in wealthier countries, I completely agree with that. But will we move a lot more further forward, or will we just race to where we are already and just sort of lift all boats to a starting line?
Mm-hmm. Well, you've drawn some interesting comparisons there. I think the problem was that what people sought for in science was a religious concept of unity between all the understood forces in the world. And we still do that to a certain extent. What actual observation tells us is that there is a tremendous area of uncertainty that's irreducible, that's the so-called stochastic phenomena, and the quantum world where everything can both vary and be superposed and change its actual form from a particle to a wave, etc. These are all concepts which most of us, I think all of us, actually cannot quite get into our heads. And I think the great danger in medicine is not so much the lack of a theory and a sort of causal chain type logic. It's more ignoring what's in front of you, and in order for it to fit into a neat theory. I've fought with this in the fields of heart failure, as it became increasingly divorced. The study of it became more or less an exercise in neuropharmacology, and he ignored all the other organs that surround the heart, to say the least. But and diabetes, where again this concentration on sugar is now being exploded with these wonderful new drugs, which reduce cardiovascular risk, which is the only thing that's really important, and restore metabolic balance, as far as we can tell, in a very beneficial way. And so, we can explode all sorts of disease categories. And I think actually that AI is going to be better than that, better than us at that. But I do agree. I mean, we need to be human beings somewhere. I mean, we all this is going to be fairly futile if all we do is just sit in rooms and watch AI do everything for us. I can only hope that that human compassion, love, caring for others, seeking meaning in what we do is going to be enhanced, because that's, after all, what we're alive for, I think. And if we can do it much better, that's marvelous. If we are just simply drained of both cash and meaning, then it's not a good prospect. Though it's better in New Zealand than it is in most places in the world, I have to say.
I want to jump in for a moment to add to my thoughts to this, because, I've also wondered on this, and I think the idea of a paradigm shift and rechanging your reference frame as now this to how harness the solar system is a good analogy. And when you think about EBM, the sole idea of EBM is that you have physicians in the role of agency, and now you have internet dissemination of information, and really this key adoption of that. If you don't adopt what we know works, how are we creating benefit? So EBM is how we can have widespread adoption, and physicians are the agents to try and better standardize care, get to where we need to be. And now there's this sense of insecurity, because with AI being able to do many of our cognitive tasks, you really need physicians in the role of agent. And a lot of the tasks that we maybe are doing are going to become obsolete. And then our fear, our thoughts become, okay, which job is going to go? Who do we not need? And some of that balances against the fact that, well, technology also creates new jobs that we can't even imagine. So although one role might go away, there may be new roles you're going to be considered, and certainly physicians are going to be needed. But the context I have is that we always are thinking about physicians as the agent. And Jonah, I really like the point you made earlier about healthcare systems and rising all boats, because maybe it's not so much as a physician as the agent, but really about healthcare delivery in general. And when you expand and say physicians are no longer the rate limiting step, it's really about recreating a different model for delivering healthcare. You'll still need physicians and everything else, but maybe we can do it differently. Maybe it doesn't have to be primary care networks and hospitals. And the way we think about it now, it can be apps or virtual or technology or networks we haven't even considered, and leveraging resources, less resources perhaps, to have greater effect in different ways. And maybe we can go to places where we'll see this innovation occur in places that currently don't have healthcare standards to what we may have in New Zealand or US or other OECD countries, but achieving it through dynamic stuff. And my biggest fear is actually that in many of our countries, the incentives for how healthcare works is so ingrained, we don't really have opportunities to innovate the way delivery might work. And that sometimes you have to kind of destroy the old before you create the new. And it's hard to do that. And maybe it's easier to do it in a place where nothing exists and you can just build from scratch. I don't know what your thoughts might be.
Yeah, I mean, it's something that I've been thinking about is, picking up on Richard's sort of exponential enhancement of access to information. We're still going to have human structures and social norms and things that we don't see until we brush right up against them. Things around prescribing and MRI, availability, and all these types of things that potentially us as clinicians will be the blockers. And how will a society respond to a billion AI agents out there trying to identify problems, recommending an intervention, and then our ability to actually provide those interventions? You could imagine a regulatory body then clamping down on some of these agents' ability to make certain decisions because of insurance. Perhaps that's a restricting factor here. There's these other types of constraints on our systems, sometimes for good reason and sometimes not for good reason. You could imagine an exponential rise in low value care. Every time you bang your knee, an MRI is recommended because that means you can completely understand that there's no problem or what have you. Obviously being a little bit facetious, but how those other types of constraints that come on in healthcare will be applied in these sorts of areas. And sometimes they'll come on for protective reasons, not in a good way. Clinicians may say, in New Zealand, and I know in other countries, there's been an aversion to other types of workforce, other types of healthcare workforce coming into clinical care and providing their expertise because there's a sense of concern around quality, payment, access, all of these other factors that can contribute. And so it is going to be really interesting to see how these agents play within that. Equally, you're going to then have agents who go out and book things and buy things and navigate the world. And so then you've got agents trying to organize your MRI scan and perhaps talking with the radiology system to book you in, and all of these weird and wonderful types of interactions that we're going to have to navigate, and we don't have unlimited resources. So it is going to be interesting to see how that plays out.
Reverse engineering is going to come in here, and improvisation. I like to think of China as a sandpit for all this. I'm sure there are things going on there which will overtake Silicon Valley and all the people who are simply looking at it from the monetization point of view, because there's so much there that people can actually play with and that the agencies cannot control. And I'm hoping that out of that we'll get some better systems that serve patients and that are in the hands of patients, because I'm nearing the end of my life, and it's been a funny period to live in. Thermonuclear weapons were first detonated when I was 3, and they dominated the fear of the whole population of the world for decades. Now we're fearing climate change with just as much reason, and you do have to accept that humanity needs to learn its mistakes every generation and just go through these cycles of futility and aggression and cruelty and stupidity. But what if AI were to actually put its mind to a science of practical compassion for everybody? Because after all, we want free lives. We don't want AI telling us what to do with the whole of our lives, but we do seek that comfort, that network that will support us at the times when we are ill, bereaved, despondent, and in need of human comfort and assistance. And that's basically what we doctors like to think of ourselves as providing. And I think we will continue to provide that. But I think we need to be humble as well and realize that we can do it a lot better. And if the right machines were to come along and help us do it, that's going to be a fabulous thing.
Could I also further maybe challenge this the AI paradigm a little bit, because in one way it could support us to help people access beta blockers when they need them. Perhaps it helps identify more opportunities for testing particular molecules to make a better beta blocker. But maybe there are things that we already know help people with their health and well-being, and these sit at the policy level, they sit at the political level. It's the social determinants of your health. It's your ability to live in a warm, safe neighborhood. It's those sorts of elements. And so there's a funny thing where, in some sense, we kind of already know some of the biggest factors that impact somebody's life almost before they're born, statistically. And we might get better and better at finding these beta blockers and deploying them for patients at scale, but still not really get any healthier, still not get any better. And I think it is the healthcare professionals' duty, I think, for us to be looking at these areas and participating in telling these types of stories, because that information asymmetry from the patients to clinicians is so vast that we have put ourselves on this pedestal and told everybody that we should be on this pedestal, and that the things that we do really, really matter. And they do in certain areas, at certain times, in certain ways, but it's not everything. I wonder what your thoughts are on that.
Well, I entirely agree, and it's not an either-or thing. The great German health reformer and researcher Virchow was vehement that germs don't exist as a cause of disease. It's all social conditions. The germs do exist, and social conditions allow them to flourish. And he was a great improver of people's living conditions. That's why I say a science of practical compassion. You can't actually have medicine outside practical compassion. I've seen patients discharged from American hospitals and indeed British hospitals to nowhere to die because no one was responsible for the next thing. And if you experience the final illness of a loved one, which I have done several times, in the end, I have been the person who's had to be responsible for coordination of care. And for these very important human events, AI doesn't provide a clickbait solution that's going to be the same for everyone. Quite the opposite. AI might enable a personalized solution and suggest possibilities and raise this is my biggest hope, that it would raise the stature of caring in society, that we actually start to care about each other because we realize much more how interconnected we are and how our artificial divisions between politics and science and religion and so on are only there as roadblocks, really, and we can do better as a human race, I hope. But now I am truly getting to be visionary and vague, so I think probably it's time for me to shut up now.
No, thank you, Richard. Raj, what's your take?
I think Richard has hit the nail on the head. It would be great if we could have artificial intelligence take up all the artificial work we're required to do, so we can focus on the real elements of human connection, compassion, caring. And I am very grateful to you for bringing up the point that, health, we always think about in terms of physical and the body and medical problems, but it's all community health. It's the societies we live in. It's the social conditions. Then, AI agent is not going to fix that. That's still on us to advocate, to promote, and to make those places better.
Now, see, we're sort of coming closer to the end of our time. One thing I wanted to talk about, and it was mentioned a little bit earlier, was COVID. And I was be curious to hear about how evidence-based medicine was approached during such a challenging and chaotic time, probably a bit bruised and battered old evidence-based medicine, but also shone its light through that in certain ways, in big ways too. I wondered, Richard, what was your take on how EBM faced up to COVID-19?
I was very disappointed, I have to say. There was an initial reluctance to put into place basic containment measures which worked on physical principles and had been employed with other epidemics, and which were now being criticized by the EBM community on the basis that they hadn't been validated by randomized trials. Randomized trials are not to be done in a life-threatening emergency epidemic situation. You work on first principles, you do the trials later. On the other hand, the greatest triumph of coordinated trial design was the Recover trial, which compared various treatments for acute hospitalized COVID. Unfortunately, it had to include chloroquine, which had no a priori place in therapeutics at all in this situation. But there you saw the triumph of people with agendas and using totally non-scientific methods to promote things. And of course, the present president of America was very much on that bandwagon at that time, and has been since. But so it shows that we still have all that basic work to do to refute falsehood, to protect the population, sometimes by forcible means if necessary. The vaccine developments were fabulous. So there was a lot on the positive side, but it did leave us all feeling bruised in different areas of our consciousness, I think, depending on how we were personally involved.
I'll offer a counterpoint and argue that I thought EBM was wildly successful during COVID. Not without controversy. You're always going to have disagreements. There's going to be controversy. There's going to be tension. But really, the value of something like EBM is it gives us a construct, a way to discuss, to argue, to make counter arguments, and then to work together to find the answers that we can all find agreeable. And it's incredible to think that from the outbreak of a pandemic, within 7 to 9 months, we had figured out several medications that could reduce severity and mortality, and successfully found vaccines that could basically prevent us from having the worst aspects of it. I mean, it is just a modern marvel that we did it as quickly as we could, and that once we had the evidence showing certain things were effective, that we just had such rapid, widespread adoption. Yeah, I just think about the clinical trials for vaccines. We had done RCTs and hundreds of thousands of patients in a matter of weeks. I mean, that's pretty spectacular. We had, the moment we knew dexamethasone could reduce mortality in critically ill ICU patients, like around the world within a week, everyone was just adopting it. I mean, that's not a successful way to discern truth and to find agreement, consensus. I don't know what it is. So positives there. We don't always exemplify that going forward, but I think good lessons. And then we realized that there were problems that EBM can't solve. There's misinformation. There's other things out there, and we have to evolve, keep up with it to fight those things.
And I keep thinking about how we talk about science more generally in the public. There was this rush to the science, quote unquote, the answers, the dichotomous do this, don't do this type of approach. And I think in some areas we do have the information, but I would say evidence is a bit more like a topographical map. It's lumpy. In some areas we have really solid ground to stand on, in other areas we don't. And I think when we are communicating the fact that it is a iterative cycle, that if we're not learning and if we're not making mistakes, we're not trying to learn, then the public, it can be quite hard for them to come along. You said this week, and now you're saying this. You're telling me that this trial reduces my risk, but does it reduce this? All of those quite complex messages, I think, need to start from a foundation of understanding, what that through line of science is. And I think also, clinicians ourselves, we need to consume that advice as well. I wonder what your takes are on perhaps now in the US, a lot of change and turmoil going on, particularly in the scientific communities, maybe to put it lightly. Raj, what's it like there at the moment from your lens in this sort of science and healthcare spaces?
In some ways, you read the news and you think to yourself, how is something like measles even spreading, in this day and age? On the other hand, day to day, people are still people. Most of them are wonderful. You build trust through compassion. You talk to them, you hope to raise awareness and make it known. And there are wider societal issues with things with social media and misinformation. It affects many fields, not just healthcare. We just have to work together to raise awareness and to combat it. And perhaps, as Richard says, it might mean that every generation has to relearn mistakes so we can do the right thing. Hopefully we can do that with the least amount of harm on our end and find a positive way through.
Thank you, Raj. Richard, any last comments on the evidence-based space and where we've gone, where we've been, and maybe where we're going to?
Well, I'm delighted that Raj gave that positive note there, because we want to end on a major chord here. This is a fabulous time in medicine. It's not that EBM is going to shrivel away. The term may disappear. David Sackett never really liked it and wanted it de-adopted in about 2000. But it's going to persist, but it's going to be hugely enriched. There are the multiple new ways of thinking out trials, Bayesian thinking about prior probabilities of treatments working, observational research being used in new ways to close the feedback loop between interventions and outcomes, and above all, patient participation in prioritizing questions of research, in sharing the results of research, in having genuine power over research, and it's ceasing to be the monopoly of the academic industrial complex. All these things are massively hopeful, and so I think 3 cheers for EBM. Long may it continue, whatever people call it.
Fantastic. Well, thank you so much, Dr. Richard Lehman, Dr. Raj Mehta. Really appreciate your time today. And that brings us to the end of the podcast. If you want to go deeper about any of these topics or join in on the discussion, visit our website, clinicalchangemakers.com, or our YouTube channel. Finally, if you enjoyed our work, please give us a rating and share your favorite episode with a friend or colleague. Until next time, take care.